Hi, Dan McGuire, TUFFY Boats Pro Staffer here, and I talked a little bit ago on a previous video about the basics of a live bait rig that we use for catching walleyes and multi-species on flowages. And again, not being as tech savvy as I should be, the file was too large earlier, so I'm doing this in a two-part, and this is part two, and this is talking a little bit about fine-tuning the presentation. With this live bait rig, I'm going to start at the sinker end of things here. And again, we're using just a single arm bottom bouncer on a barrel swivel that moves up and down our line. And with this, I tend to most of the time use a 1 ounce bouncer. And it might seem a little bit heavy, but the benefits to using the 1 arm bouncer, if you remember, if you watched part one, I talked about the steep breaks and the channel edges in that we're fishing when we're working a flowage. And what that 1 ounce bouncer allows me to do is stay fairly vertical, and I can keep that right below the boat. Usually I'm fishing this from the front of the boat off my bow mount, moving at approximately 0.5 to 0.8 miles per hour, and working the ledges and the breaks and the snags and the stumps. And again, the 1 ounce bouncer allows me to stay fairly vertical. That helps keep me out of snags. Staying vertical like that, it helps me work this bait through the snags. Again, I talked in the first one about using a long rod and lifting it up and down through the snags, and this does allow me to do that. Again, I'm not so much worried about spooking the fish. We're not really dealing with a finesse technique here. So I would say 90% of the time I've found the 1 ounce bouncer to be the size that I tend to go with. The business end of this, again, we talked a little bit in the first segment about the 14-pound managed fluorocarbon. Again, abrasion resistant. It's a tough line. The other thing again is that it's a little bit stiffer, and it doesn't allow this bait, even though it allows for some movement. As you start working through the snags, it seems to pull through just a little bit better. On the business end of things, on this one here, I've got just a soft floating jig head, and that tends to be pretty much my go-to is a soft floating jig head. The other go-to with this setup, in fact, both of my rods are rigged. One's rigged with a floater. The other one is rigged with a slow death hook. And you can take a look at that. And those of you that are familiar with the slow death hook know that they've got some bends in the hook that when you run your crawler up on this, it tends to rotate and give a nice subtle spin and a little bit of thump as it goes through the water. And again, these are the two rods that I've got rigged up that if I was heading out today, these would be the first two that would hit the water. Some other options here that we do use when we fine-tune things, and again, my two go-tos, the slow death hook and the soft floating jig head. A couple other little tricks and refinements that you can do with this setup. The one here is a streamer fly, and we do have good success pulling streamer flies. Again, snell length is very, very similar. It's tied, the snell is on the 14-pound fluorocarbon, but just the streamer fly tied on a gold Aberdeen hook. This again is a little bit of a modification to our floating head. We've got a smile blade on there and a bead in front of the smile blade. Again, snell length about the same, all tied on a barrel swivel, and that allows that to spin. And the smile blade being as lightweight as they are, you don't have to move real fast to get that thing thumping and moving. And then finally, this is a pre-tied. I believe this is a Walleyes choice from the folks up there by Livebait and Knock. And again, similar concept to the smile blade, floating head with a little Indiana or Colorado blade on there and a few beads and a clevis. And again, pre-tied with a swivel on there as well. So those are a couple little refinements that you can do to this rig. One of the things that's a characteristic of all of these, whether I'm using a slow death hook or a floating jig head or a streamer fly, is a fairly thin light wire hook. And we talked about snags. What this allows us to do, especially if you're snagging up with wood, the thin light wire hook allows you to pull that snag out, straighten the hook out a little bit. You can
bring it back in the boat, use your pliers, rebend the hook, take your hook file to it, and you're good to go. So those right there are probably the five baits that I tend to pull on this rig, again with my go-tos being the slow death and the soft floating head. And just a couple more things here before I finish up. Live bait, a lot of times it depends on the season. I tend to find myself most of the time pulling crawlers on these setups, but minnows will work on them equally as well, as will leeches. So it's all about personal preference there.